Your presentation is about 20 minutes? Great. So we have plenty of time for really going deep on pieces of the policy. What we want, the goal of this meeting is to leave from here feeling like we're all rockstar advocates on the bill, that we could go into offices and really talk really talk up this thing and, you know, talk to our legislators about it, write letters to the editor, talk to our friends and neighbors, and get people excited. So thank you all for being here. Great. Yeah.
So I know how many
That's right. Yes, I'm happy to make it available sooner. Yep, absolutely. And for those on the phone, the question is, can we share the PowerPoint? And the answer is absolutely. We're happy to circulate it. So again, I'm Dana Gastam. I'm the Climate Program Director at the Oregon Environmental Council. And I appreciate that introduction very much, but I should let everyone know that this piece of legislation has actually been a very strong and collaborative process. What we have done, where we are with the current legislation, has really been trying to look at best practices for how to design and implement a cap and invest system. It also relies heavily on the work by former Senator Chris Edwards, who really wanted this to be a legacy piece of legislation, and he was offered a better paying job than being a legislator, and so he left before this could be passed. But he put in a tremendous amount of time and sought leadership on this. But there are a number of partners and stakeholders who've really been at the table and working on this. And I want to give special acknowledgement to Maggie Talmadge with the Coalition of Communities of Color, who's put in a tremendous amount of time on this policy, as well as my colleagues at Climate Solutions, and then other colleagues around the state, and many of you who I know have really been at the forefront of pushing for this type of overarching, meaningful climate policy. Yep. Okay. You want to hear the next slide? Okay. We're going to do it that way. All right. There's so much technology, so forgive me. All right. So basically, this has been a very collaborative process to get the bill to the place that it's at, and we hope it continues to be a very strong collaborative process on the path forward. So next slide is just quickly. The Oregon Environmental Council, we're actually coming up on our 50th anniversary next year. We're started by people just like you who felt like represented. So the Oregon Environmental Council was created. We work on multiple issues in health. And we work very collaboratively to shift to a clean energy economy. This policy is really an opportunity to think about not only strong environmental outcomes, but also a strong and healthy economy. This is where we're looking to move into the future. One that is more sustaining, one that is more inclusive, particularly if we make it that way. And one that offers good quality jobs, again, if we make a high priority on that. So we're here to talk really about opportunity tonight. And I think a lot of people have an impression of the environmental community as not necessarily being pro things, but we are pro a lot of things. We're pro healthy communities, we're pro clean development, and we're pro a healthy and safe climate for everyone. Next. I do want to say that in this presentation, I'm trying to give people tools for both how we can talk about this at the high level, as well as going into detail on the policy itself. So we're going to have a combination of that. But it's also good to remind us and ground ourselves in what's at stake. And this audience, of course, knows all too well what's at stake. You are better informed than most people that climate impacts are already upon us. They are affecting every corner of our state, whether it's drought in our agricultural areas, whether it's warming water and fish kills that impact tribal communities in particular, whether it's forest fires, or whether it's ocean acidification impacting our coastal fisheries. There are almost too many impacts to name at this point, This last year was really high on the pollen side. So if you have allergies, if you have respiratory challenges, it's been a tough year. So we know it's at stake, but this also means that everyone has a stake in making sure that we solve this problem. We just need to connect to people around issues that matter the most to them. Next slide. This one, of course, is all too familiar from the summer, but there are wildfires that raged throughout the state and actually throughout the West. It was the worst forest fire season in British Columbia. The Oregonian actually had an article about tracing the fingerprints underlying a lot of the drier conditions that made forest fires more intense. And it will double and potentially quadruple into the future because of these underlying climate conditions. And again, you guys know all this, but I did want to bring it up next slide because you will hear that the legislators will say, forest fires are the real issue. What we need is a forest fire policy. We need to devote all of our resources to combating forest fires, and we will deal with climate later. And they will often deny that there's a link between it, or they'll say, forest fires, did you see all that smoke? Surely that's got to be the largest contributor to our climate pollution in the state. So I just wanted to share this information with everyone because forest fires matter, they're important, they're bad for air quality, they're dangerous for communities, they're particularly dangerous for our first responders and frontline communities. But historically, and this is data that came from Oregon State University and has been presented at the Global Warming Commission as part of a report that they are doing to the legislature. But historically, when we think about all the emissions that we put up into the air from Oregon, forest fires at their peak back in 2002 emitted less than 10% of what we currently emit today as far as emissions. So this is 6 million metric tons of pollution here in 2002. Oregon emits 63 million metric tons of pollution. The transportation sector emits 22 million metric tons of pollution, more than double anything that would come from forest fires. We'll see what the next years will be, but it is unimaginable that forest fires would actually be more than our transportation emissions. So I wanted to make sure everyone is armed with that data because that will be a common complaint that you'll hear put back on us from detractors. All right, next slide. And of course, we know that Oregon is not the only jurisdiction in the world that is interested in tackling this. This is, again, another thing to arm ourselves with. There are 31 countries that have adopted cap and invest policies. 10 U.S. states have cap and invest policies, 9 in the Northeast where they are only doing it for the utility sector. California, of course, is doing it economy-wide. China will have a cap and trade program in place by the end of 2020. Oregon's policy would have us adopt, if we adopt a policy in 2018, we would have 3 years of rulemaking and it would be implemented in 2021. So China would actually beat us. It's a road-tested policy. There's a lot of design details that, of course, matter, but this is not something that is new and untested. Next slide. So getting to the bill more specifically, the Clean Energy Jobs Bill is a cap and invest policy mechanism. It is multi-sector. It covers the main sources of climate pollution in the state, which is very important. We need a comprehensive solution. It allows multi-state interaction so that Oregon, this isn't just an Oregon do-it-alone policy, but it lets us link up within our region. It's a flexible and market-based policy. It really encourages cost-effective emissions reductions. And it answers some of the hard questions that we're going to go into later. Because when we look to do something big and ambitious, there will also be questions about how that's going to affect certain sectors of Oregon's communities and economy. And we're going to have to talk about how to grapple with some of those trade-offs. Because it is inevitable in a political system that there won't be a need for some trade-offs and some potential compromise but where we draw the lines really do matter. Next. So first and foremost, I think for this audience, I think it's really important to recognize that this policy would do something that we have never done before, and that is put enforceable limits on our climate pollution in the state. We're past the 10-year anniversary, it was in August, of Oregon passing aspirational goals to reduce climate pollution, but we've never had an enforcement mechanism for those emissions. And putting a cap on climate pollution and having it be enforceable and legally binding is tremendous. It guarantees that there will be emissions reductions and substantial emissions reductions. So our first goal was just to try and level out emissions in 2010. Oregon mostly did that in part to good policy, a little bit of economic slowdown. But now with economic rebound, we're actually finding that Oregon's climate pollution is starting to creep up again, and particularly from the transportation sector. So Oregon as a state now is actively contributing to this global problem. And we need to make sure that we are not continue to contribute, but actually bending our emissions downward. So this would require that by 2035, we'll be at 40% below 1990 levels and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And this is incredibly significant. This is not just business as usual. This is going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of intention, and it's incredibly significant. Next slide. Now, this policy does work on a market-based system. And basically what it does is it says over the fossil fuel-based emissions for Oregon, we're going to put a cap on those emissions, and they have to decrease over time. But it recognizes that 1 ton of pollution from anywhere is equally harmful, and 1 ton of emissions reduction anywhere is equally beneficial. And it says that on average, across Oregon's economy, we're going to hit that cap. But it's not prescriptive as to which sector will do what when. Instead, it uses the cap itself and a system of allowances. And as the cap decreases, basically what happens is that Oregon will put a certain number of allowances that are equal to 1 ton of climate pollution up for sale, and no more than up to that cap limit. And that amount of allowances will shrink from year to year in line with the cap. And you have to have an allowance for every ton of pollution. And so businesses have to have the right number of allowances for their emissions that they are producing. Now, in the cap and invest system, there is a floor price for those allowances. We're getting real wonky real quick, so I'm going to just make sure I've got some head nods. If you need any clarification, I'm happy to do so. But these allowances have a price attached with them, and there is a minimum price, and that minimum price goes up every year because climate impacts and the cost of climate change increase every year. Now, if there is more demand for those allowances, the policy does allow the price of those allowances to increase. It's basic supply and demand. If there are only 5 apples and you want 3 of them and I want 3 as well, and there's not 6 apples, we're gonna compete a little bit for that last apple, and we might be willing to pay a little bit more for it. And so that can create sort of a second tier price for what that allowance value will be. And so businesses can decide if it's more cost effective to reduce emissions, to purchase allowances, to try and find someone else who has some allowances and trade with them. And so that creates value for reducing emissions. You want to avoid costs, but if you yourself hold allowances that you no longer need, you can sell them, and that creates benefit and value associated with emissions reduction. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions about this piece of it. So, and I can't see any. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Does anyone on the phone have any questions? Nope, all good. Okay. All right, we've got a couple in the room, and I will repeat them for people on the phone. KB.
So just to wrap my head around the additional allowance package distribution, will certain sectors be given, okay, because they're in this section, you get to start with this many allowance, or is it just you have this many allowances and the very basic have to kind of compete for any?
Yeah, so we're going to get to that. The question is, will there be certain distribution of allowances amongst different sectors? And we will get to that. Just trying to get to kind of the basics of that first. And let's see, there's a question back here, Bob, and then, oh, sorry. Bob.
Your question would be, how is it that you bidder the bidding company? How are they identified?
Yeah, I think, you know, I might go through a few more slides because I think we'll answer some of these questions. So let's get a little more content under your belt, and then we can, if you hold those questions, unless there's any clarification on this specifically. Okay, one clarification here.
I'm kind of confused. You're saying that if a business gets a lot of carbon, they have an allowance that they can trade to somebody else. Well, why not just say, okay, you're admitting too much about stuff here. Why can they, pass it on to their allowance on someone else?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is, if there's a business that's emitting, why should they be able to trade? Why shouldn't we just say you've reduced your own emissions, stop there? And the answer is that under this type of mechanism, we're trying to create incentives for good behavior. And so if you reduce faster and more efficiently, we want you to keep doing that. We want you to see value in reducing as quickly and efficiently as possible. And if the way to give you that value is by giving you an asset, an allowance that you can trade, now you are being paid for your emissions reduction by other businesses who are polluters, rather than using general fund dollars or something else. That makes sense. But overall, there's a cap. Remember, it's not free to pollute. You have to purchase that. So every ton of pollution has a cost to it, and there's not an unlimited supply of allowances. Okay, I'll take two more, and then we'll keep moving on.
So the 10 feet. So I'm sitting on that business means I'm emitting too much and there aren't the allowances available, and I don't have a way to not emit it, so I get it. So I'm assuming that penalty would be a lot more than 5 days.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the last line on the slide is, if you don't have enough allowances for your reported emissions, there will be a penalty. And the question is, would that penalty be much greater than the allowance price? And the answer is yes. There should be no loopholes, get out of jail free for not meeting your obligations. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll answer some more questions as we go along. So the market basics. Auctions will be held. And again, the state issues these allowances up to that cap level and no more. They're held quarterly, so businesses can kind of see what their production will likely be and how many they will need over time. There again, it's that price floor that sets a minimum price for that value. So businesses again can do planning around what that cost may be. If Oregon links with other jurisdictions, we would hold joint auctions together. We would use a common platform, so Oregon doesn't have to go through the additional expense and cost of coming up with our own system. If a system already exists, it's better to just not have to reinvent the wheel. And then once allowances are purchased, they belong to that entity and can be banked or traded. So that allowance again becomes a way to comply both now or into the future. And so if you've done more to reduce emissions than maybe you need to, you can use that into the future because, again, near-term emissions reductions actually have a tremendous amount of benefit. Right now, if we reduce emissions, we're not adding as much to the cumulative impact of climate change. And so we would actually really like businesses to front load their emissions reductions as much as possible. So the banking provision can actually be very helpful in encouraging that. A question in the room.
Is it an option, like an option, like to put a bidding on it, like going up?
Yep. It can get to that point. Thus far, the carbon market has kept it close to that floor price. It's been a couple of, less than probably 50 cents above what the floor price has been. But as there's more competition and as the cap tightens, there will be more demand for those allowances and the value should increase. All right, I got a question over here.
So it's like options, about the California option, like we would be basically at whatever price level is currently being set in North America.
That's right. Yeah, so the question was, if Oregon leaks, then we would join up with California, Quebec, and Ontario, and we would have a common price floor with the other jurisdictions. And that is correct. Yes. That's right. For the point I made earlier, the question was, does banking mean you can use allowances into the next year? So every year, businesses have to report in how much pollution they emit, and they have to hold allowances up to that level. But if you have extra allowances, if you have more allowances than your emissions, then you can use those allowances into the next year. Yep. So maybe at that first auction, that quarterly auction, you went crazy and you decided, I'm going to get 100% of what I need. And by the end of the year, you actually took measures to reduce your pollution. You can hold those allowances into the following year. Yeah. And here.
Trading part of it. Well, first of all, are these allowances going to be divided or categorized with different types of businesses? In other words, you have the polluters and the non-polluters.
Yeah.
Okay. So they have different allowances. Now.
Yeah. So the allowances. I have a couple more slides that may help answer this. So well, let me get to the heart of your question. What's your question?
My question is that, you can find a business that's a non-polluter or a slight polluter that needs money, and the polluter can buy his credit, and it's still pollution.
Right. Okay. Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit. The question was about trading. So let me get to the next slide, and let me tell you about who is regulated in this program. So this, again, I mentioned is a multi-sector policy. It covers the main sources of climate pollution, about 83% of Oregon's climate pollution, which comes from the largest emitters of fossil fuel pollution. So those are the fuel importers, the kind of oil industry, fossil fuel-based utility emissions. So although we have about, close to 40 utilities, I think, in Oregon, only about 6 would be covered by this program because they're more fossil fuel intensive. And then there's other emitting industries that might use a lot of natural gas on site for manufacturing or otherwise. Now, all of these entities already do half of what this program requires, which is to measure, monitor, and report what their climate pollution is. The reason we know that Oregon has 63 million metric tons of climate pollution is from this type of reporting. And so this program, because we're looking at entities that have enough staff on hand, that are good at navigating systems, we want them to be of a certain size to be able to participate in this type of mechanism. So it's the largest emitters who emit over 25,000 metric tons of climate pollution. And to give you a benchmark, that's about 133 rail cars of coal burned in a year. So it's a lot of pollution. The folks who are not covered by this policy are farm operations. Most of them don't even come close to hitting that 25,000 metric tons. Forestry activities, again, a lot of them don't hit that, and they're biological, livestock, and then small businesses. So that somewhat gets to your question. If there are businesses that aren't very carbon intensive, they're not in this program, and there's not trading between them. Yeah, so again, the question was, I'm concerned about livestock not being included. When we're looking at requiring allowances for every ton of pollution emitted, you have to be able to measure that pollution with a high degree of certainty. And it's much harder to do that from agricultural systems. And that's why this type of program isn't necessarily designed to get at these emissions, but other policies can and should. So again, I didn't say at the outset, but this is a very important and critical piece of the climate puzzle. But we need a whole portfolio of policies to drive emissions down to those levels that I talked about at the beginning. We cannot trade off what we already have, and we're going to need more. We're going to need to be able to do more. All right, I'm going to take a couple. Let me pause. Folks on the phone, do you have any questions? Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions in the room. Yes.
Okay, so how is it decided, and who decides how many metric tons of pollution are allowed per year?
Yeah, so that's set in line in statute. We say, right now we know how many emissions there are. By 2035, we're going to get to 40% below 1990 levels. Now, we could do that in a straight line. We could do that in a curved line. That will be left up somewhat to the rulemaking process. We may decide we want to try and front load as many emissions reductions as possible at the beginning, or we may want to have a gentler curve at the beginning and let people get used to it and then do more work towards the end. But those targets have to align with what other jurisdictions are at. So California said 40% reductions by 2030. And so we have to be similarly stringent to others in our region who we want to link up with. And ultimately, we're looking at how does this align with the Paris Climate Accord and sort of international consensus around what reductions are needed. Oregon's climate goals were set to be, back in 2007 when they passed, were at least 75% below 1990 levels. Clearly, the world has not done a good job reducing climate pollution, so those end goals actually have to keep being strengthened and strengthened over time. Question here.
Why not 2030 for us if it's the same as California?
Yeah, as long as they're approximately similar. I believe that point was chosen because it was a midpoint between to the 2050 goal, that there needed to be some sort of interim target. Yep. Question here.
So do you think there is ionized and considered the largest polluter and say that we said the measure monitor work? So that's if they're monitoring themselves.
The question for folks on the phone is, are the businesses measuring and monitoring themselves? To a certain degree, yes. So they have to report their emissions to DEQ and to the Environmental Protection Agency. So there is some auditing that is done. But as part of this type of system, there actually has to now be certification of those emissions. So in California, there's a whole protocol. And then DEQ would also bring on additional staff to be able to check those reports. Yep. Yep. Yeah, but there needs to be quality assurance, and then DEQ in their penalty matrices, if an entity purposefully misreports their emissions, additional and more severe penalties can be applied. Yep. All right, other questions in the back. Okay, we'll come back to that one. All right, any other questions about this? And one more check. Folks on the phone, any other questions from you? Okay, we'll move to the next slide. So I did want to get to the point where we're talking about some of the hard questions. So folks will say that level of emissions reduction is insane. It is impossible. It is infeasible. It will drive every business out of Oregon's economy. The state will fall off into the ocean and disappear forever. And that's probably like the nicest thing that you will hear opponents say about this. So there is a question about what about industries in Oregon that are energy intensive and trade exposed, meaning that they're subject to a lot of global competition. They're very, very price sensitive. And if a price on climate pollution translates into increased prices for energy, because right now that pollution is free, what if those businesses leave the state? That's called leakage. And the issue here is if they simply uproot out of Oregon, they take their economic activity with them, but they also just relocate their pollution and potentially to a place that actually is less climate smart than Oregon. And so pollution may actually increase overall. So California has had to grapple with this. Quebec and Ontario have had to grapple with this. And what they came up with is an idea to designate energy intensive trade exposed businesses, but do it in a way that is very data driven and actually looks at what is the competitive risk for businesses actually leaving, how price sensitive are they, and what is the minimum amount of assistance that they would need to stay in Oregon. Now, as you can imagine, this could get very political very quickly. Why wouldn't ExxonMobil just say, hey, I have to compete with myself globally, I should get some compensation. So the policy right now as written says that this designation has to be done in conjunction with a third-party analysis and should not be driven by politics. And that it should be reevaluated over time because there will be a sensitivity to try and get this passed to probably over-allocate initially. And as we've seen, British Columbia with their carbon tax, they initially gave out a lot of sort of tax giveaways to a lot of industries that actually didn't need them, but they use it in order to get the policy passed in the beginning. There's a trade-off with this. What the remedy is to give some of these businesses free allowances to mitigate the price impact or the potential price impact. Now the trade-offs here are one, you're no longer auctioning that, you're not sending a stronger price signal. Two, when you don't auction, you're not raising proceeds that can be reinvested back in solutions. And three, you are allowing these entities to continue polluting and reducing sort of the incentive for them to reduce their emissions. Now, there are pros and cons of that, of course, and they have to be specially considered. In Oregon, many of our large greenhouse gas stationary sources are in more remote parts of the state that don't have a lot of population around them. That is somewhat different than California, where you have refineries right in the middle of communities. But still, this is a value that is given to those entities. And so the trade-off here is, do we potentially risk losing businesses and risk losing the entire policy because it's seen as wrecking the economy? Is there another way to think about compensating businesses to keep them here? And what's the minimum amount of accommodation that can be granted? So this is a big one. This one, it really matters, especially for communities that live close to these facilities. And it's one we need to think about very carefully. There's a question in the back of the room. No, so the question for folks on the phone is, would those free allowances affect the overall cap? No, they have to be given within the cap allowance, so it does not increase the cap. Other questions about this piece? Yeah. The question is, would free allowance be allowed to be traded? I believe likely not. Well, there may be two cases. So we'll get to utilities in a moment. But actually, I may rethink that. Likely they will need to be used by those entities themselves. And if it does create an economic incentive for them to reduce their emissions so that they could sell them, I think we might actually want them to be able to do that. But I think that there's very few cases where they would be so in need that they would turn around and end up selling them. Yep. Questions from folks on the phone or comments that I can repeat to people in the room? Let me just check with folks on the phone for a second. No. No, it's the chat. Okay. All right. Here.
It would almost be good to have like previous sell for them rather than get credit. That kind of all just to give them some sort of level of trade secrets, they don't want that, but on some macro level, there may be opportunities.
Yeah. So for folks on the phone, the suggestion was that there should be a 3-year strategic plan that might be industry or even facility specific about how they can reduce their emissions over time rather than trying to compensate them with free credits. Okay, we come over here.
Could you give a couple of examples of other kinds of things that would set up the special credits on the tax rate?
Yeah, so other ideas that have come up are, is there a way to rebate some of the proceeds from the sale of allowances back to these energy intensive industries to compensate them for any price increases? You could imagine trying to use other state resources to try and do additional energy efficiency or create incentives to try and help them decarbonize. So that might be using general fund dollars to try and do that. But that might be outside the scope of this policy, or using some of the proceeds to be able to do that from the sale of the allowances. Yeah, this is a great question. Who would make the final decision on what type of special treatment might be given and how many allowances? So my personal preference is that would be worked out in the rulemaking process and not set in statute, because if it's set in statute, it's very, very difficult to change. And we want to be able to have a process to look at this. We don't want these to be quick political decisions. So this should be worked out in the rulemaking if this structure moves forward. Yep.
And will there be an agency set up to administer this, and will that agency have to be self-supporting?
Yes. Will there be an agency set up to do this, and will it be self-supporting? Yes. Sorry, some of the very, very basics I left out. So this program would be administered by the Department of Environmental Quality, which already does a lot of the regulatory programs in the state. The bill does give fee authority, so for the agency to be able to start collecting fees essentially as soon as the program goes into effect, so that they can have resources to develop the program, and then they could have fees to administer the program over time. So yes, it would be self-sustaining. There are other agencies that would also be involved, whether it's in overseeing some of those sectors, so the utility sector, the investor-owned utilities, PGE, PacifiCorp, Northwest Natural, Idaho Power. They would be under regulation from the Public Utility Commission. There is imagined a role for kind of our new and evolving Department of Energy that wants to be able to do more on climate change. They may have a reporting or data collection or analysis role. They may have a role in administering some incentive programs into the future, although there's a lot of discussion about if that's the right role for them or not. And then there is a component where it looks at workforce training. And so Business Oregon has also been named in the bill as an entity that could oversee some of those programs. Yes, and the Department of Transportation. So our best understanding is that the fees collected from the transportation sector from the sale of allowances would be restricted to the Highway Trust Fund, and that would be administered then by the Department of Transportation. Okay, we're gonna keep going. The other hard question to grapple with is the question about low-income Oregonians who already spend a disproportionate amount of their income on energy. And again, if we're thinking about pricing pollution from our energy system, there may be a change in price. And so how do we make sure that we're leaving people whole and actually potentially even improving their lives? So a lot of other jurisdictions have done a number of things. One, with the utilities, the way the program is laid out in this bill, it says for utilities, we are going to consign to you a set number of allowances. And so they're going to, quote, be theirs. You have to give those back and sell them in auction, but the sale of those proceeds flow back to benefit the utility sector. And that is overseen by the Public Utility Commission. And the bill lays out priorities for the use of those proceeds. The first is to compensate low-income customers through on-bill rebates. We want to make sure that this is done in a timely way, not just on an annual basis. The bill also lays out priority uses, and we can actually, Shilpa, go to the next slide. Oh, I forgot about this one. The other thing to grapple with, sorry folks on the phone, we just went to the next slide on offsets. I'll come back to the low income piece in a moment when we talk about the proceeds as well. So the other thing to discuss currently in the bill, it does allow the use of offsets, and offsets are verifiable, certifiable emissions reductions from those uncapped sectors. So agriculture, livestock, forestry. If you can verify that you're doing something new because of this offset financial mechanism, and you can reduce and measure that pollution reduction and make it durable throughout time, you can generate an offset that can be used by those regulated entities to meet their compliance. And so that means that you may have a combination, but you can only use a limited number of offsets. Right now, the bill says it's 8% or what's needed to link to other jurisdictions, so we have to be of similar stringency. And it's limited to offsets generated in the US or linked jurisdictions. And then it encourages development of Oregon protocols that meet those same quality standards. So right now, there are certain forestry protocols, for example, that are really based on California practices, should there be some that are developed for Oregon that meet the similar stringency. So the rationale for this is that it creates additional flexibility for the regulated parties and potentially lowers overall compliance costs, because often offsets can be generated at a lower cost than other types of emissions reductions. But remember, 83% of our emissions come from fossil fuels, 17% from biological systems. You can't offset your way out of this problem and meet 40% reduction. It's mathematically impossible. And there are actually conversations wondering if 8% is too high. California just reduced this number in their reauthorization. There are a lot of people who feel like, you know, the polluters are where the reductions really should happen. And so there's going to be a conversation about what is the right level of offset use. I will say that the business community has identified this as one of their top priorities for design elements, that they really want offset. It gives them additional flexibility. So there will be a robust debate. Offsets also give us an opportunity to engage rural economies in other ways, but there may be other ways to also engage rural economies. The question in the back of the room. Nope, we're going to come back to that. Yep, I have some proceed slides later on that are going to get to some of that as well. So any questions about offsets? Oh, of 8% of their compliance obligation. So if I emit 100 tons of pollution, I can use no more than 8% to meet that. I have to hold allowances for whatever that is, 82%. Quebec and Ontario. At this point in time, we would hope that, well, we hope other states would set these caps as well and join in. Are there any questions or comments from folks on the phone? Anything in the chat? Okay, back of the room. Oh, so every year, every compliance period, these businesses have to hold a certain number, all of the allowances to match the pollution they're emitting. But they can use, for 8% of their pollution, they could use offsets instead. And it gives them another tool to be able, so at the end of the day, if I'm DEQ and you emit, I'll try and do a different number, 30 tons of pollution, you can use, oh gosh, my math is so bad. I should have done 100. You can turn in 82 allowances and 8 offset credits. Sorry, 92 allowances. Jeez Louise. You can do 92 allowances and 8 offset credits to total 100 overall.
And one offset might be what?
One offset means it's equal to 1 ton of pollution reduced, and they come from projects like, someone mentioned methane earlier, dairy digesters, building a biodigester to capture cow poop and digest it and capture the methane is actually very expensive. If an offset project makes that possible, and that's a new and additional project, the pollution, the tons of methane captured and destroyed would count as, for every ton of methane destroyed, you could get an offset credit. Sorry, that was a little roundabout way to describe that. That's right. Yep. So they would fund emissions reductions to destroy methane at your dairy. Yep. Question. Oh, so the question was, and the evildoers would get that, and the answer was yes, they would have to fund that reduction. Question in the back of the room. Yeah, so they have to be established protocols that are based in science. So you have to be able to measure and verify that there's real emissions reduction done. So that could be forest management changes that sequester carbon in forests. There may even be wetland protocols, because our wetland restoration is really important for a variety of ecological reasons, but they're also carbon sinks. It could be these dairy digester projects, and there's a number of other protocols. It could be urban forestry to reduce heat island effects and plant more trees. There's a variety of things.
Yeah, yep. So if timber tract owner doesn't clear cut his tract, he can get the credit. Yeah,
so the question is, if a timber landowner stops clear cutting, could they get an offset? Potentially. It would depend on how long they're not clear cutting for. It has to be really long time horizons. You might change your crop rotation. It might not mean that you have to completely stop harvesting trees, but you might change your forest management practices along the way. In some cases, it may be complete forest easements. It may be allowing a bunch of smaller family landowners, woodland owners, to band together and say, we're going to put this in a conservation easement so it doesn't get turned into subdivision. Another question. Yep. The question for folks on the phone is, we always have problems with fire and forest. How can we guarantee that those reductions would be maintained? So for forestry projects in particular, there is a requirement that you actually have an insurance pool. So say I have a forestry project that generates 20 tons of reduction. Well, about 5 of those tons get set aside in an insurance pool so that if there is a loss of forestry resources, you've overcompensated. You've made more reductions than you can actually sell to protect the environmental integrity of that. And the forestry sector bands together and does that. So again, you only get to sell a certain amount, but you reserve the opportunity. You reserve some of those to make sure that if there are losses, you've actually done more than what you've gotten recognition for. Creates a buffer pool. There's a lot of good detailed questions. All right. Next slide is the benefits of regional participation. We've talked about this a little bit. Oregon joining other jurisdictions means we get to use existing resources and infrastructure. We get to do peer-to-peer learning with other state agencies and other industry sectors. There are cost savings that come from this. Our state agencies are not very well resourced, and so we need to think about how we're actually going to implement successfully these programs. It creates a more even playing field because we have similar stringency requirements. We have similar price signals that are being set. It takes away that leakage and competition argument because we're doing something similar to other jurisdictions. And I think this is really important, this last point. It requires equal stringency and rigor. I guarantee that if Salem decided the level of stringency for this program, for Oregon to do it alone, it would not be 40% emissions reductions and 80% by 2050. They would do a much, much smaller bite size. But by linking, we have to measure up to the other jurisdictions. And that creates a very, very important backstop on that stringency. All right, question here.
Is there any downside to regional participation that is not contained in what you just presented? I don't know what it would be like to turn comment that would be better off doing the cover of that last side. And I don't know why.
I feel like that's similarly linked to what we learned from other jurisdictions. And it's really good.
Great. Yes. Okay. So again, this is for you all to sort of arm yourself with some stats and data. Other jurisdictions, again, have done this. We can talk about some lessons learned from this program in particular, but 9 northeastern states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative have done cap and trade over their utility sector. They've reduced carbon pollution significantly. They've also reinvested the proceeds back into energy efficiency and renewables and have actually cut electricity rates. That goes counter to what every opponent will ever say about this type of program. And in the meantime, state economies have grown since the implementation of this program, I think in 2009. And in part because of that reinvestment mechanism, especially during the economic downturn, it was very interesting that these 9 states really weathered the storm much better than programs in the states that did not have a climate control program in place. Think about that. That goes counter to everything that you'll hear about how climate or environmental policies harm the economy. States performed better with this policy in place. Yes.
The 25%, is that 25% improvement in state economies?
I believe so, but I will double check that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, question here.
Will there be a regional authority? Because I could, in my suspicious mind, I can visualize a state saying, hey, we need to improve our economy, we're going to lower our pollution rates.
Yeah.
And so the leakage, we'll get the leakage.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the question is, will there be a regional authority? Because once states are in this, one might say, hey, to get a competitive advantage, I'm going to weaken my program and get everyone to come to my state. The answer is yes and no. So there is a nonprofit organization, the Western Climate Initiative, Inc., that runs the auctions, that runs the sort of has all the online systems. They develop it and they administer it for the states, but they don't have policy authority for any state. And if states decide to change their rules and become weaker, I believe there's sort of like a council of states that sort of look at equal stringency, and you could probably get kicked out of the program if you try and game it in that way. Good question. Okay. All right.
I'm wrapping my brain around this, and I guess the question that pops up in my mind is, what would happen if you had a disaster? For example, if you have a big, massive disruption of our entire infrastructure, and all this stuff that gets started is sort of ripped up Main Street. And I don't really know my country, so I want to throw that for break.
Question has, what happens in the case of a 9.0 earthquake? I think all bets are off for everyone and everything. I don't think that's a scenario that we can necessarily contemplate in this policy.
How does it affect the insurance? It's kind of all second.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that sometime later. That's like, let's have beers and talk about that.
I'm not sure how valid it is, or 2009 about the bottom yet.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. But I think that still it's relevant and valid that even at the bottom of the economic hardships, these states performed better than the national average. Most opponents would say, surely those that had the climate program in place would have suffered more. And what they found is that they actually performed better. So it's not necessarily saying you can attribute all of the economic growth to this policy, but it's saying that there was growth even with this policy in place. Questions? That's right. REGI is only on the utility sector. They started just with the utility sector. What we're proposing, utilities, power generation. Yep. All right. And I just want to let you know that there are some other resources that look at if we price climate pollution in Oregon, what we'll do to the economy. The Northwest Economic Research Center at PSU with the carbon tax, they still found that Oregon's economy could continue to grow while we reduce emissions. And similarly, DEQ did a greenhouse gas market study. It may change the rate of growth, but growth continues. That's also important to consider and have in your arsenal of responses. Next, California's experience. So they've been putting in place ambitious climate programs since 2006. California has a multifaceted strategy. Cap and invest is one piece of it. But when you look at, again, aggressively going after reducing climate pollution, they have really started to decouple growth from fossil fuels. So population has increased, employment has increased, GDP has increased all at the same time that they've reduced electricity consumption. Greenhouse gas emissions have fallen over 7%, and petroleum consumption has also been reduced over that same time. And again, detractors would say economic growth depends on fossil fuels. And California is sort of a test case to say that it's not necessarily true. And again, not everything is about economic growth. We're trying to arm you with some tools for a common argument you will hear.
Is California on track to reach its goal?
Yes. California had, their first goal was to just hit 1990 levels by 2020. They're on track to actually exceed that. And just so you know, California has to reduce 80 million metric tons of pollution by 2020. That is more than the entire state of Oregon emits in a single year. So they're going to meet that goal. And then they're going to do 40% by 2030. And they're on their way to do that as well. That's going to be a bit more of a stretch, but they can do it. Yep.
Are these studies also linked to European experience?
These particular ones are not, but when we can come back to that at the end, what the lessons that we've learned. Yep. I threw this one in. Just California did a big reauthorization of their program. They had to get bipartisan support. There were some surprising folks who came out in support of the program, in part because of the way it's designed. It allows, again, a decent amount of flexibility, and the reinvestment of proceeds has actually created some really interesting economic opportunities throughout the state. Every county in California had gotten some type of reinvestment from the sale of that auction revenue, and that it was actually creating jobs in a number of places that can be directly traced back to climate programs. Just another fun thing to have out there if needed. I'm going to keep moving us along and we'll keep going. So overall, if we look at the amount of pollution we have in the state, if we look at that minimum floor price for what we think allowances will be at in 2021, and we imagine sort of a similarly administered program to what California, Quebec, and Ontario have done, we estimate that the program could generate $700 million of proceeds every year. And when we think about that cumulatively, you can get up into the billions within the 2030 time period. The bill, this graphic sort of divides what that cumulative benefit for proceeds would be between the transportation sector, since that's again restricted to the Highway Trust Fund, and then what would be non-transportation related. Many of you have probably seen this chart on some of the Renew Oregon fact sheets. If you want a copy of it, we can certainly get it to you. We'll go to the next slide. What I want to talk about is the purpose of this bill, which we all know, but it's important to state because this is what directs and guides the use of proceeds. The purpose of the bill is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and create climate and economic resiliency. And so the bill is really looking at how do we mitigate climate pollution, but also how do we build some resiliency, and how do we create co-benefits. So proceeds can be used for resiliency upgrades for critical infrastructure, and particularly thinking about the transportation sector, where a really cold winter followed by a really hot summer put a lot of wear and tear on our systems. So there's some repair work. There's also the opportunity to think about increasing culverts for stream flow or fish passage or increased water flow that may come through. There's, of course, development of low and no carbon energy resources, renewables. Thinking about how we can get dual wins, things like investing in efficient and affordable housing. If we can cut energy costs again for low-income households and site housing near services or transit, we can really do a lot to further a more just and equitable economy. In California, they allow the use of greenhouse gas dollars for efficient and affordable housing. It's a really important climate solution. And they're able to leverage for every dollar invested by their greenhouse gas fund, they get $10 of private sector investment. So it's a huge benefit and return on investment. We could think about using some dollars for transit options, although we can't use Highway Trust Fund dollars for that. And the bill also lays out that there is opportunity for job training, for bridges to early retirement, for a number of things as we prepare workers for the clean energy economy, or even consider workers who are transitioning out of fossil fuel intensive industries. It's really important that we take care of people along the way in the transition. I'm going to pause here for some questions. I see hands.
Here it talks about education and affordable housing, but what about investment in office buildings, retrofitting, especially state office buildings?
Yeah, yeah.
And then state, then
yeah, so the question is, what about other types of buildings? Yes, of course, energy efficiency, weatherization of the buildings, of the building stock.
Private, state held. So,
yeah.
So then finally they would actually pay the state back.
It's a good point.
So on that previous slide, you had I'm just wondering how quickly I was trying to. I really am going to need to look at the slide for the ramp up that is there for transportation, non-transportation, for the 2022.
So to clarify, it's cumulative, it's not per year.
Right, no,
Okay.
So it starts out at about 1.5 million, roughly, in 2022.
No, we'll
Billion.
700 million total in 2020.
For transportation proceeds and for non-transportation proceeds.
Yeah. Do you think that? Yeah. Yep. Cumulatively. Good question. Yep.
Any thought is, and I know that has any thought is putting into practice, particularly around training and the that might
Mm-hmm. So the question is, has there been any thought about particular job training for the Coos Bay area? Yep. Yeah. Yep. We're looking at, is there a way to think about alternatives to the Jordan Cove project through clean economy investments? Yeah, the bill is not so prescriptive to target a particular area, but certainly that would be an opportunity. There's also, you know, we have some really interesting job training centers, whether it's union organized. Unions are really good at training people that do a lot of this type of work. We have community colleges and technical institutes so we have the infrastructure to be able to do this and scale it up as well. Great question. Yep.
Has there been any thought given to creating, as part of a job training, something like a GI Bill, where people in a place like Coos Bay might be relatively heavily impacted short run by like this, and that workforce is just never going to be able to combat the fossil fuels that it's done. So it seems like having something like the GI Bill would be a significant component.
Yeah, the question for folks on the phone is there something contemplated like a GI Bill, but more for kind of fossil fuel impacted workers? And the answer is yes. The bill, the term for it in the bill is a just transition fund that is particularly targeted at workers who may be in industries that will be transitioning. And it's not just job training or retraining. It's also a lot of people in these industries are actually close to retirement. Are there opportunities for bridges to early retirement? What are the other services that are needed to support people? So it's broader than just job training. All right, let's go. I think we're close to the end. Yeah, so priorities for investment, and this gets back to the question about regressivity and how we're going to help people along the way. So the bill designates two important set of communities for particular focus for reinvestment opportunities. The first are most impacted communities, or communities, individuals that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So these are folks who are hit first and worst by climate impacts, and frankly, traditional pollution as well. So characteristics may be low income, people of color, people with low educational attainment, people who are very old or very young, and folks who are underemployed. And these are characteristics, no matter what the stressor is, you have fewer resources to be able to respond and react. You've historically been underinvested in by society at large. And so this bill is saying we have an obligation and responsibility to make sure that investments are flowing to these communities, and that communities have a say in how those investments are done. It also looks at economically distressed areas in the state, which there's an official definition, but those are mostly rural areas. And it says, let's think about giving specific dedication of resources to these communities. And it's to mitigate any negative impacts, but also to create benefit and opportunity. It's not enough just to mitigate the bad. It's critically important that we actually create benefit and opportunity. Question in the back of the room. So for folks on the phone, the question was, is reinvestment in projects enough, or is a dividend method better? I think that's a valuable question to raise. I will point out that the purpose of the bill, though, is also to ensure that we're reducing climate pollution, and we have to make sure that in designing a program, we are actually matching the use of proceeds back to the purpose of the bill. Otherwise, it could risk looking more like a tax and be subject to higher vote counts. So there's some legal considerations and ramifications there. And I think there's also a really healthy debate about the fact that there are a number of communities that have been underinvested in, and what they want are community attributes that are healthy and thriving and have green spaces and have transit options and have the community amenities that communities deserve. And so there are a number of representatives of most impacted communities that say, we actually really want to see investment in our communities. We want to have a say at what those investments are, what those projects are, but we think that there's value in investing in our communities. Yep.
Yeah, we're kind of seeing some of that happen in Coos Bay. They were underinvested in. They kind of, through no fault of their own, squandered their timber resource. And I was surprised to see Hardy Wilson signed on as a supporter.
Yeah.
Because he's all great guns on the gas line.
Yeah.
So we do have to take care of those people.
Yeah. Yep. We need to create opportunity. Absolutely. Question in the back.
Yeah, so here's an idea. In my day job, I actually one of the criticisms I heard from my employer about this is that there's not enough specific designation.
Yeah. There's a working group process that's going on right now to look at, the question is, what about, I guess, tribal communities writ large in Oregon? Do these designations, are they inclusive enough? And is there specific allocation for tribal communities as well? Does that capture it? Yeah. So there is a working group process right now to workshop this bill. They have 4 different topics. There's one on environmental justice and kind of worker issues, and looking at how is this the right designation, who's left out, what needs to be done there. Shilpa is actually doing a bit of outreach. I wonder if you want to talk about the engagement that we're doing.
Okay. So I sit on the Environmental Justice and Just Transition Work Group. We are conducting a series of meetings to better define the role, the wording of impacted communities. And I was just in a meeting today where representatives from tribes were arguing that even with census tract data, you're not really capturing, I mean, tribes, especially those that live on reservations, have an outsized impact. Like they're reliant on food sources that are dwindling because of climate change. They're not going to move. They're not going to become climate refugees because they are where they're from. And so we're looking very seriously right now at doing a distinct tribal investments carve out. That's just funds set aside so that they aren't competing with money for low-income housing or weatherization or any of those other things. And Joel Moffitt at ATNI and Don Sampson are working most closely with us on that. That has its pros and cons. So I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards, because then the reality is, if it's the last in, is it the first out in negotiations? That's something we have to be very careful with. We don't want to get something that's critical for the most vulnerable members of our state to get peeled away just because negotiations are going to get messy. So we're actually in conversation about that right now. Yeah.
Let's see. Someone was that? Okay. Okay. Did you have a question? Okay. I want to make sure if folks haven't asked questions yet that I get to you. Otherwise, let me come to you. Yeah, so there was research commissioned by Portland State University. So we have a professor who has actually done a literature review to think about how do you designate communities, what are the variables you look at, and how you weight them. And so those demographic factors that I talked about, they recommend heavily weighting to race and income, and then looking at health exposure on a lower level, and try to think about what's the minimum number of variables that really capture vulnerability. So that's not a big, complicated black box process, but it's something that can be used and built upon. But it's under discussion about, does this capture everything that needs to capture? So they did two things. So they have to look at publicly available data. So they have, for this designation, they've looked at census tracts. For the economically distressed areas, it's a little bit different. It's counties and cities, and it doesn't always match up perfectly with census tracts.
So we're really figuring that out right now. I mean, there's one of the
problems, not problems, one of the things that we're delving through is that there are multiple iterations of this bill over the years. And so economically distressed areas was a definition from the Chris Edwards days, and that from the Senator Edwards days, 2015, 2016-ish. And then most impacted communities is a new solution to try to get at a more, laser focused, where are the communities, because economically distressed areas is a little bit, it doesn't really capture. So we're trying different things, and we may actually either combine them or do away with economically distressed areas because the census tract data is more laser focused. So we're still working that out right now in the work group process, and it's a public process. So the next meeting is coming up on October 16th and 17th. You can tune in via OLIS, so it'll be all online, and you can look into the video feed, and then you can submit comments to the committee emails and things like that.
We'll be sending out information, articles, and trying to really promote people getting to these working groups next week, and then in November, the little the statewide department campaign will be sending out information to encourage participation at the engagement.
Yeah, and that's actually the last slide.
I would say that economically distressed areas in Oregon are not necessarily mostly.
Yeah, not entirely. That is true. But I think it's really important for legislators to see themselves in this legislation. They want a call out to rural areas. They want to make sure that communities, so it's important that the language of the bill actually reflects the intent. Right now, I think a lot of people feel like they don't see rural areas as much in this bill. And so we'll see how that balance plays out. Yep.
I get the impression that it is believed that there will be enough money generated by this program to invest those in pre-existing community dollars and to invest in mitigating the direct effects of our greenhouse gas limiting program.
So the question or the comment is, the sense is that there's enough money that could be generated to address historic harms as well as aid in the transition. I would say that this legislation, no, is not going to raise everything that we need to raise. To really make this transition, to really invest in communities, is going to take societal investment in this at a much larger scale. But where you can get multiple benefits, that's what this policy is looking for. So if we're going to be putting solar panels up on community centers, what's the program that looks locally to train and hire locally within a community that historically has been underinvested in? Those programs exist around the country. There is no reason why Oregon can't do that too. So how are we getting multiple benefits? Who is doing this work? when public dollars are put out through the Highway Trust Fund in pursuit of these goals, is it women contractors? Is it minority-owned contractors? Who is benefiting from that? So the bill also builds in technical assistance so that, again, communities can compete for the benefits that this bill offers. So a lot of design elements do matter, but it's trying to think about how do you harness multiple benefits and how we do this work as well. Yep.
I have a question. One, I think we heard that DEQ is going to manage this program. Many of us have their DEQ, which they're on the commission that's here to be problematic. And so I'm assuming that this is going to be a program that is self-contained in terms of money in, money out, and that there will be enforcement built into the DEQ thing in terms of it, who has money to spend on anything. So, and it just historically has not been stellar in terms of enforcing any kind of natural resources.
Yeah, so the comment was, for folks on the phone, let me take it little bit by little bit, a lack of faith in DEQ to administer programs and follow up on it, and that will there be lock boxes around the dollars so that they can't just get yanked away for other purposes? Specifically for enforcement, yep.
And number two is, when I hear this being discussed, a lot of discussions, and I don't quite understand as you are trying to make this work its way into the economy. The initial gains will be more deeply accomplished in certain industries because they're more nimble.
Yep. Yep.
And then there's a sense that there's going to be some like dark cloud in 2035 where people can't change this. And I don't think yet.
Yeah. So the question for people on the phone is, there's a lot of discussion around low-hanging fruit, that there are easier emissions reductions that can happen earlier along. And then at some point, you hit a point where it just gets harder. So probably the best thing I can point you to is, has anyone ever heard of the McKinsey curve? It looks at, it's this diagram that looks at all sorts of individual actions that can be taken, efficiency, certain HVAC improvement, and a whole variety of efficiency measures, whether it's residential or public. And it says really for anything that's efficiency, you gain more than you spend from the savings over time. But as you march through different types of measures, you might start to get more and more expensive until you get to the point where you have carbon capture and sequestration at coal-fired power plants that require aquifers to capture and pressure to maintain, and that's a very, very expensive emissions reduction, and there's a lot of risk associated with it. So it's looking at thinking through all those individual measures and where they fall on the line as far as cost and then a return on investment. And so at some point you do start to exhaust all the cheap things to do. Even if you're looking at, weatherizing your own home, it's a lot less expensive to put in insulation than it is to swap out all the windows. And so you're it's that sort of measure by measure approach analysis. And the transportation sector, it's a lot of individual decisions. Utilities is a couple of decision makers. You can make relatively large emissions changes by engaging with a relatively few number. Transportation, it's a lot of fleet owners, it's a lot of individuals. It's just harder to reach people and more costly. Yep, Sandy. Yeah, yep, and that's a great point. And don't we often count on technology? Yes, there is a long glide horizon to say, hey, we've got to change these systems over decades, but when you put a price on things, people start to innovate, and we expect innovation to come. And certainly we've seen that. I mean, the cost of solar and wind has come down dramatically in the last 10 years.
How does this interface generally with regulatory rollback, or does it not?
At the federal level or in general?
In general, especially this kind of question that is my representative, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so the question is, how does this type of policy interact with federal or regulatory rollback? So I would say that anything that helps us reduce climate pollution in the state helps this policy. If we are collectively reducing pollution, that helps us meet our cap. Undoing programs and policies that reduce pollution makes this harder, makes it more costly. So there's actually a virtuous cycle with policies that help us reduce pollution. I anticipate there will be discussions about trade-offs. I do not anticipate that they will be successful. Yep.
Is there a chance that over time, somewhere between say 2030 and 2040, that the revenue stream produced by this program will actually begin to dwindle, and the consequence, the investment in these communities that are most vulnerable will become more and more difficult?
Yeah, the question for folks on the phone is, will there be a point in the out years where investment dollars start to dwindle because we're reducing pollution in line with the cap? Yeah, there will be a point where it starts to plateau, but it somewhat depends, you know, on if we have a lot of laggards and they're trying to, you know, have a higher demand for allowances, and allowance prices are above that floor price. So even with pollution coming down, if you have your floor price going up, you actually get a decent amount of revenue and decent amount of stable revenue or proceeds over time, even with emissions coming down. Yep.
So, I have a question about the timeline of the implementation of this.
Yep.
Was the first bump dollar amount of 2022, was that because that's the first time money collected, or not collected?
Yeah, question about implementation timelines is 2022 the first time dollars are collected. So the program would go into effect in 2021. So there would be auctions starting in 2021. That chart was showing cumulative impact, so it had 2 years of accumulation. So that's why it started at 2022. That's right. Yep. Good question. Detailed person over there. We want him on our work group. Yep, that's it.
I'm really hoping that we'll have some time. We have a lot of folks here who are going to be meeting as constituents with their legislators, and part of our hope here was that we're looking to make every Portland area legislator champion. So we'd like to see some time devoted to questions regarding how do we engage with those legislators, what sort of strategies we're going to employ in order to really have the impact we want to have. So they're going to go out and twist arms and do what they can to ensure that this bill passes in 2018.
Yep. That's great. So we should segue to Shilpa. Rick, did you have? Yeah. Folks on the phone, we're about to wind down, so any questions or comments? All right. Hearing none, thank you all so much. Thank you for your deep engagement, for your great questions, for thinking through this on a level of detail that we don't see in a lot of other rooms.